I never thought silence could hurt so much. But standing there, in the middle of that wedding hall, surrounded by 200 people I barely knew, I learned that words can cut deep, but silence can destroy you completely. My name is Nora, and for 23 years, I believed I was building something that couldn't be broken. I was wrong. The day started like every mother's dream. I woke up at 5 in the morning, my heart racing with a kind of joy I hadn't felt in years. Today was David's wedding day. My son, my only son. The boy I raised alone after his father walked out when he was just 2 years old, disappearing into the night without explanation, without remorse, without even a forwarding address for the child support checks that never came. I remember standing in our tiny apartment that morning, pressing my hands against the fabric of the dress I'd bought for this occasion. It wasn't expensive. I'd found it on clearance 3 months ago and had been saving it like a treasure. Navy blue with small white flowers. Simple, but dignified. I wanted to look like someone who belonged at her own son's wedding, even though a voice in the back of my mind whispered that I never quite belonged anywhere anymore. The dress fit differently than it had in the store. My body had changed over the years, not from indulgence, but from the opposite. Too many meals skipped so David could have seconds. Too many nights working double shifts at the diner, standing on my feet until my ankles swelled and my lower back screamed for mercy. My hands, once soft, were now permanently marked by years of washing dishes in scalding water and scrubbing floors on my knees. But I didn't care about any of that today. Today was about David. I arrived at the venue early, carrying the small gift I'd managed to put together, a photo album I'd spent months creating, filled with pictures from his childhood. Every birthday party I'd somehow managed to throw despite having almost nothing, every school achievement, every Halloween costume I'd sewn by hand because store-bought ones were beyond our budget. I'd written little notes beside each photo, memories I wanted him to carry forward into his new life. The wedding coordinator barely glanced at me when I introduced myself as the groom's mother. She checked her clipboard with the efficient disinterest of someone who'd seen too many weddings to find magic in them anymore. "You can wait in the side room," she said, gesturing vaguely toward a door. "The immediate family will gather there before the ceremony." Immediate family. The words should have included me, should have centered on me, but something in her tone made me feel like an afterthought. I walked into that room and immediately felt the temperature drop. Not literally. The air conditioning was working just fine, but emotionally. David was there, looking more handsome than I'd ever seen him in his tailored suit. My breath caught. This was my baby. The child I'd rocked through countless nights of fever. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike in the parking lot behind our building because we couldn't afford to live near a park. But he wasn't looking at me. He was standing beside a woman in her late 50s, perfectly coiffed, wearing a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. Margaret, David's new mother-in-law. She had her hand on his arm, laughing at something he'd just said, and he was looking at her with an expression I couldn't quite name. Admiration? Gratitude? Something that made my stomach tighten. "Mom," David said when he finally noticed me, his voice polite but distant, like he was greeting a distant relative rather than the woman who'd given him everything. "You made it. You made it." As if my presence was optional, as if there was ever a universe where I wouldn't be here. "Of course I made it, sweetheart," I said, moving toward him with my arms already opening for an embrace. But Margaret shifted slightly, still holding his arm, and the moment became awkward. I ended up patting his shoulder instead, my hands trembling slightly as I pulled back. "You look so handsome," I whispered, feeling tears already threatening to spill. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks," he said, and then turned back to Margaret, who was saying something about the photographer's schedule. I stood there for a moment, holding my small gift bag, suddenly aware that everyone in the room had someone to talk to except me. David's groomsmen were clustered by the window, laughing about something. The bridesmaids were taking selfies in the corner. Margaret was now discussing seating arrangements with the wedding coordinator, her voice confident and commanding in a way that made it clear she was someone used to being listened to. And I was invisible. I found a chair in the corner and sat down, smoothing my clearance dress over my knees. The fabric suddenly felt cheap under my fingers. I could see a small thread pulling loose near the hem. When had that happened? I tried to push it back in, but it only made it worse. The ceremony itself was beautiful. I won't lie about that. The venue was elegant, not over the top, but tasteful in a way that spoke of money spent thoughtfully rather than extravagantly. White roses everywhere, soft classical music playing, sunlight streaming through tall windows, creating patterns on the polished wooden floor. I sat in the third row, at my own son's wedding. The first row was reserved for Margaret and her husband, David's new in-laws. The second row held various relatives from Sarah's side, aunts and uncles and cousins who'd known David for maybe a year at most. And I was in the third row, squeezed between David's old college roommate and someone's elderly grandmother, who kept asking me if I knew where the bathroom was. When David walked down the aisle, I couldn't see him properly. The person in front of me kept shifting, their head blocking my view. I leaned to the side, craning my neck, desperate to see my son in this moment I'd been dreaming about since he was born. But I only caught glimpses. His profile, his hand adjusting his tie, the way he smiled when he saw Sarah waiting for him at the altar. I'd imagined this day so many times over the years. In my version, I was sitting in the front row, maybe even walking David down the aisle since there was no father to do it. In my version, he would look back at me during the ceremony and mouth, "I love you," or give me that little smile that used to be just ours. In my version, I mattered. But reality is rarely kind to our fantasies. The reception was worse. Much worse. If you enjoy stories of resilience and justice, please subscribe to the channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and every single person matters so much to us. And please comment which city you're watching from. It helps us know we're not alone in these stories. I found my assigned seat at table 7, surrounded by people I'd never met, distant cousins of Sarah's family, a few work colleagues of David's that he'd barely mentioned. The centerpiece was beautiful. More white roses, candles, elegant place settings, but it felt like a decoration rather than a celebration of anything I was part of. From where I sat, I could barely see the head table where David and Sarah sat with their wedding party, and, of course, Margaret and her husband. Margaret was holding court, it seemed, standing every few minutes to make toasts, to laugh loudly at jokes, to lean over and whisper something to David that made him nod and smile. I picked at my food: chicken in some kind of cream sauce, roasted vegetables, a small salad with dressing I didn't recognize. Everything tasted like nothing. Or maybe I just couldn't taste anything anymore because my throat was so tight with unshed tears. "Are you the groom's mother?" the woman next to me asked, her voice making polite conversation. "Yes," I said, trying to smile. "Yes, I am." "That must be so wonderful," she continued, cutting into her chicken. "Watching your son get married. Such a special day." "It is," I lied. "Very special." But inside, something was cracking. That same feeling I'd had 23 years ago when I realized David's father was never coming back. That sensation of the ground shifting beneath your feet. Of discovering that what you thought was solid was actually just an illusion that could disappear the moment you stopped paying attention. I watched Margaret stand up again, this time clinking her glass to get everyone's attention. The room quieted, all eyes turning toward the head table. "I just want to say," Margaret began, her voice carrying easily across the room, "how blessed we are to welcome David into our family. From the moment Sarah brought him home, we knew he was special. He's been like a son to us, and today, it's official." The crowd applauded. David was smiling, his arm around Sarah, looking happier than I'd seen him in years. And I was sitting at table 7, invisible, my hands gripping my napkin so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Like a son to us. The words echoed in my mind. What did that make me? The music shifted to something slower, more emotional. I recognized it immediately. The mother-son dance. My heart jumped. This was my moment. Finally, after sitting through speeches and toasts that barely acknowledged my existence, I would get to hold my son, to dance with him, to have those few minutes where everyone would see that yes, I was his mother. I was the one who mattered. I stood up from table 7, smoothing down my dress, my hands shaking with anticipation. I'd practiced what I might say to him during this dance. Nothing elaborate, just, "I love you," and "I'm so proud of the man you've become." Simple words that carried 23 years of sacrifice and devotion. But David didn't look toward table 7. He didn't scan the room searching for me. Instead, he stood up from the head table, adjusted his jacket, and walked directly toward Margaret. I froze halfway between my seat and the dance floor, my breath catching in my throat like I'd been punched. This had to be a mistake. Maybe he was going to escort Margaret somewhere first, then come get me. Maybe there was some tradition I didn't know about. Maybe. Margaret stood with a gracious smile, taking David's offered hand. The DJ's voice came over the speakers. And now, the groom will share a special dance with the woman who helped shape the man he's become today. The woman who helped shape the man he's become. Not his mother. Not the woman who gave birth to him, who stayed up nights when he had pneumonia at age 6, who worked 3 jobs to pay for his college textbooks. Just the woman who helped shape him. And she wasn't me. I stood there in the middle of the reception hall, between tables 6 and 7, watching my son take his mother-in-law in his arms and begin to sway to the music. People were watching them, smiling, some dabbing at their eyes with napkins. A few guests turned to look at me, their expressions confused, pitying. One woman leaned over to whisper something to her companion, both glancing in my direction. I couldn't move. My legs had stopped working. My brain kept trying to process what was happening, kept searching for an explanation that would make this bearable. Maybe David had already done a dance with me and I'd forgotten? No, that was impossible. Maybe this was a special dance with Margaret and mine would come next. But the song was already half over, and these dances typically only happened once. The truth was unavoidable, sitting heavy in my chest like a stone. I had been replaced. Somehow, in the months leading up to this wedding, in the year or two since David had gotten serious with Sarah, Margaret had inserted herself so completely into my son's life that she'd taken the place I'd held for 23 years. And David had let her. Worse, he'd chosen her. The song ended. People applauded. David hugged Margaret, and even from where I stood, I could see him say something to her that made her laugh and pat his cheek affectionately. The gesture was so intimate, so maternal, that it physically hurt to witness. I turned and walked quickly toward the bathroom, my vision blurring with tears I absolutely would not let fall in public. Not here. Not in front of these people who already seemed to think I was irrelevant. The bathroom was empty, thank God. I gripped the edge of the marble sink, staring at my reflection in the ornate mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed older than her 47 years. When had the lines around my eyes gotten so deep? When had my hair gained so much gray? I'd been too busy surviving to notice myself aging. The door opened and 2 young women entered, bridesmaids, from their matching dresses. They didn't notice me in the corner stall area at first. "That was so sweet," one of them said, touching up her lipstick. "The way David honored Margaret like that. Sarah told me Margaret basically became like a second mom to him this past year." "I know," the other replied. "Apparently his real mom is kind of, I don't know, distant? Sarah said David never really felt like he had a proper family growing up. That's why Margaret means so much to him. Distant." The word echoed in my head. I had been called many things in my life. Stubborn, proud, tired, but never distant. I was the opposite of distant. I was so present in David's life that I forgot to have my own. "Where is his real mom anyway?" the first bridesmaid asked. "Oh, she's here somewhere. Table 7, I think?" Sarah said they had to invite her, obviously. But David wanted to make sure Margaret felt special today since she's been more of a mother figure to him lately. They left, their high heels clicking on the tile floor, their perfume lingering in the air like evidence of my humiliation. I waited another 5 minutes before returning to the reception, using the time to fix my makeup, to breathe deeply, to construct a mask of calm that I could wear for the rest of this nightmare. But it only got worse. As the evening progressed, I watched a parade of moments that should have included me, but didn't. When it was time to cut the cake, Margaret stood right beside the bride and groom, her hand resting on David's shoulder as the photographer captured the moment. I was somewhere in the background, probably visible if you looked carefully at the edges of the frame. When guests lined up to congratulate the newlyweds, Margaret positioned herself in the receiving line as if she were the mother of the groom. People hugged her, thanked her, told her how wonderful the wedding was. A few people approached me afterward, almost as an afterthought, their congratulations feeling hollow and confused. "Are you David's aunt?" one elderly man asked me. "No," I said quietly. "I'm his mother." "Oh," he looked genuinely surprised. I thought, well, that other woman seemed like, sorry, my mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. Not really. It was exactly what David had orchestrated, whether consciously or not. Margaret was the mother figure at this wedding. I was just someone who happened to give birth to the groom 26 years ago. The worst moment came during the speeches. Margaret stood up, glass in hand, and the room quieted with the kind of respect usually reserved for important people. She spoke about watching David and Sarah's love grow, about welcoming him into their family, about how proud she was to gain a son like him. "David," she said, turning toward him with genuine emotion in her voice, "you've brought so much joy into our lives. From those first dinners at our house where we got to know you, to the holidays you've spent with us, to now, watching you marry our daughter. It's been an honor to be part of your journey. You're not just our son-in-law. You're our son in every way that matters." The crowd erupted in applause. People were crying. Even David looked emotional, standing to hug Margaret while Sarah beamed beside him. Our son in every way that matters. I felt something inside me snap, not break. That would suggest there was still something whole left to break. This was more like the final collapse of a structure that had been crumbling for a long time without anyone noticing. After Margaret's speech, I waited. Surely someone would invite me to say a few words. Surely David would gesture for me to stand, to share a memory, to be acknowledged as the person who actually raised him. But no invitation came. The DJ moved on to announcing the bouquet toss. The wedding coordinator was organizing the single ladies. And I was still sitting at table 7, my prepared words dying in my throat, my hands clutching my untouched wine glass. Around 9 o'clock, I finally gathered enough courage to approach David directly. He was standing near the bar with a group of his groomsmen, laughing about something. I waited at the edge of their circle, trying to catch his eye. "David," I said when there was finally a pause in the conversation. "Sweetheart, could I talk to you for just a minute?" He turned, and for a brief second, I saw something flicker in his expression. Guilt? Annoyance? I couldn't quite read it. "Mom, yeah, sure. What's up?" His tone was polite but hurried, like I was a guest he needed to briefly acknowledge before returning to more important conversations. "I just wanted to give you your gift," I said, holding out the photo album I'd been carrying all evening. "I made this for you. It's pictures from when you were little, all our memories together." He took it, glancing at the cover. A simple album with his baby picture on the front, one of the few professional photos I'd ever been able to afford. "Oh, that's nice. Thanks, Mom." He set it on a nearby table without opening it. "I'll look at it later when things calm down. I also wanted to tell you how proud I am of you," I continued, my voice starting to waver despite my efforts to keep it steady. "And how much I love you. I know I wasn't able to give you everything growing up, but I always—" "Mom," he interrupted gently but firmly, "this isn't really the time. Can we talk about this another day? I need to get back to the guests." Another day. The most important day of his life, and he couldn't spare 5 minutes for the woman who'd given him everything. "Of course," I whispered. "I understand." But I didn't understand. I didn't understand any of this. As he walked away, rejoining his friends, I looked down at the photo album sitting abandoned on the table next to someone's empty champagne glass and a crumpled napkin. 23 years of love, reduced to an inconvenient interruption. I stayed until almost midnight, though every instinct told me to leave. But leaving would mean admitting defeat, admitting that I didn't belong at my own son's wedding. So I stayed, sitting at table 7 while people danced and laughed and celebrated around me like I was a ghost they couldn't quite see. Around 11, I watched Margaret present David and Sarah with an envelope. From their reactions, Sarah's gasp, David's wide-eyed surprise, it was clearly generous. Probably a check for their honeymoon, or maybe a down payment on a house. The kind of gift that changes lives. The kind of gift I could never afford to give. My own gift, the photo album, remained on that side table, forgotten. At some point during the evening, someone had moved it to make room for dirty plates. It now sat partially hidden behind a flower arrangement, its cover stained with what looked like red wine. I left without saying goodbye. No one noticed me gathering my small purse. No one saw me slip out the side door into the parking lot, where the spring air felt cold against my flushed cheeks. I sat in my 15-year-old sedan for a long time, watching through the venue windows as the celebration continued without me. The drive home took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of streetlights blurring through tears I could finally let fall. 40 minutes of my mind replaying every moment of rejection, every small cruelty, every clear message that I was no longer needed or wanted in my son's life. When I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, I noticed Mrs. Chen from 3B taking out her trash. She waved, smiling. "How was the wedding?" she called out cheerfully. "Beautiful," I managed to say. Just beautiful. It was easier to lie. My apartment felt smaller than usual that night. One bedroom, a cramped kitchen, a living room that could barely fit a couch and coffee table. This was what 23 years of single motherhood looked like. Not the spacious home I'd dreamed of giving David, but a place where we'd learned to make do with less. I'd always told myself it was temporary. Once David graduated, once he got established, maybe we'd pool resources and I could move somewhere nicer. Maybe he'd help me the way I'd helped him. But those were fantasies, I realize now. David had found a better family, one with resources and elegance, and the kind of life I could never provide. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a headache that felt like my skull was being compressed from all sides. My phone showed 3 missed calls, all from my supervisor at the diner where I worked weekends. I'd requested the day off for David's wedding, but apparently there was some crisis with the schedule. No calls from David, no text thanking me for coming, no acknowledgement that I'd been there at all. I dragged myself to work that afternoon, my body moving on autopilot through the familiar routine of taking orders, delivering plates, refilling coffee cups. The diner was busy with the Sunday lunch crowd, families mostly, parents with their children, grandparents treating everyone to pancakes and bacon. I watched a mother wipe syrup off her young son's face, the gesture so tender and automatic. The boy, maybe 7 years old, grinned up at her with pure adoration. "You're the best mom in the world," he said loudly, and she laughed, kissing the top of his head. I had to excuse myself to the back, pretending I needed to check on an order, just so they wouldn't see me crying into my order pad. "You okay, Nora?" my coworker Linda asked, catching me in the kitchen. Linda was 62, had worked at the diner for 30 years and had a way of seeing through everyone's pretenses. "I'm fine," I said automatically. "Was yesterday your son's wedding?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. Linda studied me for a moment, then patted my shoulder with her rough, work-worn hand. "Sometimes our kids grow up and forget where they came from," she said quietly. "Doesn't mean you failed. Just means they're too young to understand yet what you gave up for them. Yet." Such a small word, but it contained a universe of hope I wasn't sure I could believe in anymore. The weeks following the wedding were worse than the day itself. At least at the wedding, I'd been present, even if invisible. Now I wasn't even that. David and Sarah went on their honeymoon, 2 weeks in Italy, courtesy of Margaret and her husband. I knew this because I saw the photos on social media, not because David told me. Pictures of them in Rome, Florence, Venice. Beautiful couple, beautiful locations, beautiful life. When they returned, I waited for a call. A week passed, then 2. Finally, I broke down and called him. "Hey, Mom," he answered, his voice distracted. I could hear Sarah laughing in the background. "What's up?" "I just wanted to see how you're doing," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "How was the honeymoon?" "It was great. Really great. Hey, I'm kind of in the middle of something. Can I call you back later?" "Of course, sweetheart." He didn't call back. I tried again a week later. This time he did answer, and we had an actual conversation. 5 minutes of superficial updates about his new apartment, his job, nothing of substance. When I mentioned maybe getting together for lunch, he said he'd check his calendar and let me know. That was in May. By July, we still hadn't had lunch. Meanwhile, his social media showed regular Sunday dinners at Margaret's house. Pictures of him and Sarah with Margaret's family, backyard barbecues, game nights. A whole life I wasn't part of. I stopped calling as much. Partly because I couldn't bear the repeated rejections. Partly because I started to wonder if I was making him uncomfortable by trying to stay in his life. Maybe the kindest thing I could do was step back, let him have the family he'd chosen without the reminder of the life he'd left behind. But stepping back didn't stop the pain. It just made it quieter, more private. My co-workers at the diner started noticing changes. I'd always been reliable, cheerful even on difficult days. Now I was just going through the motions. I smiled when appropriate, said the right things, but there was a hollowness to it. "Have you talked to your son recently?" Linda asked me one afternoon during our break. "Not really," I admitted. "He's busy with his new life." "You raised him alone, didn't you?" I nodded. "And now he's acting like you don't exist?" When she put it that way, so bluntly, I felt the tears coming again. I'd gotten good at crying silently, at letting tears fall while keeping my expression neutral. "I must have done something wrong," I whispered. "Failed him somehow. Otherwise, why would he—" "Stop," Linda interrupted firmly. "Don't you dare blame yourself for his choices. You did everything you could. Sometimes kids get seduced by an easier life and forget what real love looks like. But what if she was wrong? What if I really had failed David in some fundamental way? Maybe I'd been too tired, too stressed about money, too focused on just surviving to give him the emotional support he needed. Maybe Margaret gave him something I couldn't, not just money, but a sense of stability, of normalcy, of what a real family was supposed to look like. Maybe I was never enough, and he'd finally found someone who was." In August, David called me. I almost dropped my phone when I saw his name on the screen. "Mom, hey. I know it's been a while." "That's okay, sweetheart," I said quickly, desperately. "I know you're busy. How are you?" "Good. Really good. Listen, Sarah and I are having a small dinner party next Saturday. Just close family. Margaret thought it would be nice if you came." Margaret thought. Not David wanted, but Margaret thought. "I'd love to come," I said, my heart already racing with hope and dread. "Great. 6 o'clock. I'll text you the address." The hope carried me through the week. I bought a new blouse. Nothing expensive, but something nicer than my usual clothes. I made a dessert, apple pie from scratch using my mother's recipe, the one David used to love as a child. I practiced conversations in my head, planning how to be pleasant and unobtrusive, how to fit into this new world without causing problems. Saturday arrived. I dressed carefully, checked and rechecked the address, and showed up exactly at 6, carrying my pie in a glass dish covered with aluminum foil. Sarah answered the door, looking effortlessly elegant in casual clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Nora, come in. We're so glad you could make it." The apartment was beautiful, modern, spacious, clearly expensive. I could see Margaret immediately, holding court in the living room with several other people I didn't recognize. She noticed me and offered a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be Nora," she said, approaching with her hand extended. David's mentioned you. As if we'd just met. As if I were some distant relative rather than the woman who'd raised her son-in-law. "I brought pie," I said, holding up the dish like an offering. "How sweet. Sarah, could you take that to the kitchen?" I was directed to a seat at the dining table, the furthest from where David and Sarah would sit at the head. Throughout dinner, I tried to participate in conversations but found myself constantly lost. They talked about vacation homes, investment strategies, private clubs. Their world was so foreign to mine that I might as well have been listening to a different language. David barely looked at me the entire evening. When he did speak to me, it was with the same polite distance he'd use with any guest. "How's work, Mom?" "It's fine, same as always." "That's good." And that was it. The depth of our connection, reduced to small talk. The moment that finally broke me came near the end of the evening. Margaret was telling a story about a recent trip she and David had taken to look at potential investment properties. "We make such a good team," she said, smiling at David. "He's got his father's head for numbers and my eye for potential." I told him, "David, you're the son I always wanted." The son I always wanted. Those words hung in the air like a verdict. I watched David's face, waiting for him to correct her, to say something that would acknowledge I existed, that I'd been his mother for 26 years before Margaret entered his life. But he just smiled, squeezed Margaret's hand, and said, "I'm lucky to have you in my life." I excused myself to the bathroom shortly after, locking the door and gripping the edges of the marble sink. So different from the chipped porcelain in my apartment, trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest. This wasn't a panic attack. This was something worse. This was the slow realization that I'd lost my son not to distance or disagreement, but to replacement. Someone had simply walked in and taken my place, and he'd let her. When I returned to the dining room, dessert was being served. Not my apple pie. That remained in the kitchen, untouched, probably already forgotten. Instead, Sarah had made some elaborate French pastry that everyone exclaimed over. I ate a few bites, tasting nothing, while the conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. I left as early as I could without being obviously rude. No one tried to stop me. David walked me to the door, gave me a quick hug that felt obligatory, and said, "Thanks for coming, Mom. We should do this again sometime." We both knew that was a lie. The drive home blurred with tears. I had to pull over twice because I couldn't see the road clearly enough to drive safely. Other cars passed me on the highway, full of people heading to their own lives, their own families, completely unaware that someone was falling apart in a 15-year-old sedan on the shoulder of the road. When I finally made it home, I found my apartment exactly as I'd left it. Small, quiet, empty. The silence was oppressive. For 26 years, I'd structured my entire life around being David's mother. Every decision, every sacrifice, every dream had been filtered through that identity. Who was I now that he didn't need me? Who was I now that he didn't even want me? I stood in the center of my living room, looking at the photos on the wall. David as a baby, gap-toothed at 6, proud in his high school graduation gown. That last photo was only 8 years old, but the boy in it felt like a stranger now. Or maybe I was the stranger. Maybe I'd always been deluding myself about our relationship, seeing love and connection where there had only been obligation and necessity. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. I couldn't face people, couldn't put on the mask of normalcy when everything inside me was screaming. I spent the day in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. Had I been too clingy? Too needy? Had I embarrassed him with my modest life, my working-class job, my inability to give him the things Margaret could offer? Or had he simply grown up and realized that the woman who'd raised him wasn't someone he wanted to be associated with anymore? The questions tormented me, but no answers came, just more silence, more emptiness, more proof that I was alone in a way I'd never been alone before. September brought David's birthday, 27 years old. I'd been there for every single one of his birthdays, from the moment he was born to last year, when we'd had a quiet dinner at a restaurant he'd chosen. This year, I wasn't sure what to do. Should I call? Send a card? Show up with a cake like I used to when he was young? In the end, I sent a text message at midnight on his birthday. Simple, undemanding. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. I love you and I'm so proud of you." He responded 14 hours later. "Thanks, Mom. No, I love you too." No invitation to celebrate, just acknowledgement that he'd received my message and felt obligated to respond. I spent that evening sitting in my apartment, eating the small cake I'd bought for him, the one I'd hoped to share if he'd wanted to see me. Each bite tasted like failure. I was 47 years old, and I'd somehow become a person my own son couldn't be bothered to spend time with. Linda noticed something was seriously wrong when I returned to work. I'd lost weight, not intentionally, just because food had stopped seeming important. My clothes hung looser on my frame, and the bags under my eyes had become permanent fixtures. "You need to talk to someone," she said during our break one day. "A counselor, a therapist, someone." "I can't afford therapy," I said flatly. It was true. My insurance from the diner barely covered basic medical care. "Then talk to me. Talk to anyone. Because this," she gestured at me, "this isn't living. This is just existing. And barely. But what was there to say? That I'd given everything to raise my son and he'd decided I wasn't good enough? That I'd been replaced by someone richer, more sophisticated, more worthy of his love? That every sacrifice I'd made, every skipped meal, every extra shift, every dream I'd deferred, had been rendered meaningless by his choice to build a new life that didn't include me? The words felt too pathetic to speak aloud. October came, and with it, the announcement I'd been dreading. David called, actually called, which was rare enough to make my heart race with hope and fear. "Mom, I wanted to tell you before you saw it on social media. Sarah's pregnant. A grandchild. I was going to be a grandmother. The news should have filled me with joy, but instead, I felt a deep, aching dread, because I knew, with absolute certainty, that I wouldn't be allowed to be a real grandmother to this child. Margaret would claim that role too, just like she'd claimed everything else. "That's wonderful, David," I managed to say, my voice barely steady. "I'm so happy for you both. Thanks. We're really excited. Margaret's already planning the nursery." Of course she was. "When is the baby due?" "Late April. Sarah's about 3 months along. We waited to tell people until we were past the risky period. We, Sarah, and David. Apparently, I didn't qualify as someone who deserved to know earlier, to share in the worry and hope of those first fragile months. "I'd love to help in any way I can," I offered, hating how desperate I sounded. "Maybe I could knit some baby clothes or—" "That's really nice, Mom, but Margaret's already got everything covered. She's ordered all this designer baby stuff, but I'm sure we'll figure out ways for you to be involved." Sure, some vague future involvement that would never materialize. I'd seen this pattern before. After we hung up, I sat on my couch for hours, watching the light fade from the windows as evening approached. A grandchild. A baby who would call someone else grandma, who would grow up hearing stories about Margaret's importance while I remained a footnote. The woman who existed somewhere in the background of their father's past. I thought about my own mother, who died when David was 12. She'd been so devoted to him, spending every Sunday with us, teaching him to bake cookies, reading him stories. He'd loved her completely, the way children love grandparents who shower them with affection and attention. Would my grandchild ever know that kind of love from me? Or would I be kept at a distance, allowed only supervised visits at convenient times, always feeling like an outsider in my own family? The holidays approached with a dread I'd never felt before. Thanksgiving, Christmas. These had always been our special times, just David and me against the world, making our own traditions when we couldn't afford elaborate celebrations. We'd watch movies, cook simple meals together, exchange small, meaningful gifts. This year, I knew it would be different. The confirmation came via text message in mid-November. "David, we're doing Thanksgiving at Margaret's. Big family thing. You're welcome to come if you want, but I know it might be uncomfortable with so many people you don't know. You're welcome to come if you want." The phrasing was deliberate. He wasn't inviting me. He was giving me permission to attend, making it clear that my presence was optional, possibly even unwelcome. I stared at that message for hours, composing and deleting responses. Part of me wanted to demand better treatment, to ask him when I'd become so irrelevant in his life. Part of me wanted to accept graciously, to take whatever scraps of his attention he was willing to offer. In the end, I wrote back, "That sounds lovely. What can I bring?" His response came 2 hours later. "Nothing. Margaret has everything planned." Of course she did. Thanksgiving Day arrived cold and gray, matching my mood perfectly. I dressed in my nicest outfit, a dark green sweater and black pants that had once fit perfectly, but now hung loose on my diminished frame. I'd stopped eating regularly somewhere around October, not as a conscious choice, but because food had lost all appeal. Margaret's house was in an expensive suburb, the kind of neighborhood where houses had names instead of just numbers. Cars lined the street, BMWs, Mercedes, even a Tesla. My old sedan looked embarrassingly out of place, like someone's poor relation come to beg at the door. The house itself was spectacular. 2 stories of brick and glass, with a perfectly manicured lawn and seasonal decorations that probably cost more than I made in a month. Through the large windows, I could see people moving around inside, laughing, holding wine glasses, living the kind of life I'd never be able to provide or participate in. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, gathering courage. Did I really want to subject myself to this? To watching David dote on Margaret while treating me like a stranger? To making awkward conversation with people who viewed me as an unfortunate reminder of David's humble origins? But if I didn't go, it would give him one more reason to exclude me completely. So I forced myself out of the car, walked up the stone pathway, and rang the doorbell. Margaret answered, dressed in an elegant cream-colored dress that made my sweater look shabby by comparison. "Nora, you made it," Margaret said, her smile pleasant but distant. Come in, come in. Everyone's already here. Everyone's already here. The implication was clear. I was late, even though I'd arrived exactly at the time David had mentioned. Or perhaps I'd never been part of everyone to begin with. The house was filled with people I didn't know. Margaret's extended family, Sarah's friends, David's new colleagues. I recognized a few faces from the wedding, but no one who would remember me or care that I was there. The air smelled of expensive candles and roasted turkey, and classical music played softly from hidden speakers. I found David in the living room, laughing at something Margaret's husband was saying. When he saw me, his expression shifted, not to happiness, but to something that looked almost like resignation. "Hey, Mom," he said, coming over to give me a brief hug that lasted maybe 2 seconds. "Glad you could make it. Let me introduce you to some people." But the introductions were perfunctory, forgettable. "This is my mom, Nora. Mom, this is Jim and Carol. They're friends of Margaret's." Nobody seemed particularly interested in talking to me, and after a few minutes of awkward small talk, they drifted away to more interesting conversations. I spent most of the pre-dinner hour standing near the window, holding a glass of water I'd gotten from the kitchen, watching David move through the room like he belonged here. And he did belong here. That was the painful truth. He fit into this world of wealth and sophistication in a way he'd never quite fit into the small apartment where I'd raised him. Dinner was even worse. The table sat 20 people, a massive oak piece that probably cost more than everything I owned combined. I was seated at the far end, between an elderly uncle of Margaret's who was hard of hearing and a teenage cousin who spent the entire meal texting under the table. From my position, I could barely see David and Sarah, who sat at the center near Margaret and her husband. I watched as Margaret stood to make a toast, watched as everyone raised their glasses and laughed at her charming stories. I watched as David looked at her with admiration and gratitude, the way a son looks at his mother, the way he used to look at me, before he found someone better. The food was exceptional, turkey cooked to perfection, sides that tasted like they came from a restaurant, desserts that looked like works of art. I ate mechanically, each bite feeling like an obligation. The elderly uncle tried to make conversation a few times, but his hearing issues made communication nearly impossible, and eventually we both gave up and ate in silence. After dinner, people moved to the living room for coffee and more conversation. I found myself standing alone near the fireplace, watching families cluster together, watching David and Sarah cuddle on the couch while Margaret told stories to an attentive audience. No one missed me when I slipped out early, claiming I had to work early the next morning. David walked me to the door, his hands in his pockets, his expression guilty, but not guilty enough to change anything. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said. "Thanks for inviting me," I replied. And we both knew neither statement was entirely true. I cried the entire drive home, the kind of crying that leaves you exhausted and hollow. When I got back to my apartment, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. 47 years old, but I looked older, tired, used up, irrelevant. That night, something inside me changed, not broke. That had happened long ago. This was different. This was acceptance. The kind of bone-deep understanding that no amount of hope or effort was going to change my situation. David had made his choice. He'd found a new family, a better family, and I was nothing more than a reminder of the life he'd left behind. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and made a decision. If I couldn't be the mother David wanted, maybe I could at least be someone else. Someone who didn't define her entire existence by a relationship that no longer existed in any meaningful way. I started saying yes to extra shifts at the diner. More work meant less time to think, less time to feel. Linda noticed immediately. "You're working yourself to death," she said one evening as we were closing up. "I need the money," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie, but mostly I needed the distraction. I stopped checking David's social media. Every photo was a knife wound. Him laughing with Margaret's family, celebrating milestones I hadn't been invited to, living a life that was perfectly happy without me in it. Why torture myself? I stopped calling. If David wanted to talk to me, he had my number. Months went by. He didn't call. Christmas approached, and this time I didn't wait for an invitation that wouldn't come. When David finally texted to say they were doing Christmas at Margaret's again, I responded that I had to work. It was a lie. I'd already arranged to have the day off, hoping against hope that this year would be different. But it was easier than subjecting myself to another holiday of being invisible. On Christmas Day, I worked a double shift at the diner, serving families who were traveling, people who didn't have anywhere else to go, elderly folks who came in just for the company. In a strange way, I felt more at home there among these strangers than I had at Margaret's lavish house. Linda worked that day too. We closed up the diner together around 9, and she surprised me with a small wrapped gift. "You didn't have to," I started. "Open it," she insisted. Inside was a small silver bracelet, simple but pretty, and a card that read, "For the strongest woman I know, don't forget your worth." I started crying right there in the empty diner, and Linda hugged me while I sobbed into her shoulder, releasing months of accumulated grief. "He doesn't deserve you," she whispered. "Your son doesn't deserve what you gave him." But that was the thing. I didn't want to be someone David had to deserve. I wanted to be someone he loved, someone he chose, someone who mattered to him, and I wasn't. I never would be again. January brought new pain. Sarah had the baby, a girl they named Emma. I learned about it on social media 3 days after she was born. David had posted photos of her in the hospital, tiny and perfect, wrapped in a pink blanket. Margaret was in many of the photos, holding Emma, gazing down at her with the expression of a doting grandmother. I wasn't in any of them. I hadn't even known Sarah was in labor. I sat on my couch, staring at those photos on my phone, trying to feel something other than emptiness. This was my granddaughter, my first grandchild, and I'd found out about her existence the same way a distant acquaintance would. A week later, David sent a brief text. "Sorry I didn't call earlier. It's been crazy. Baby's name is Emma. Everyone's doing well." I responded, "She's beautiful. Congratulations." What else could I say? That it hurt to learn about my grandchild through social media? That I felt erased from the most important moments of his life? That every day I wondered what I'd done to deserve this exile? I said none of those things. I was learning that silence was easier than vulnerability, that not expecting anything meant never being disappointed. February came, and with it, a surprise. David called, actually called with his voice, not just a text. "Hey, Mom, I know it's been a while." "That's okay," I said automatically, even though it wasn't okay, had never been okay. "Listen, I wanted to ask you something. Emma's baptism is next month. Would you like to come?" Would I like to come? To my own granddaughter's baptism, as if it were a casual invitation to a work party rather than a major family event. "Of course I'd like to come," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "When is it?" He gave me the details. A Sunday afternoon at Margaret's church, reception to follow at her house. "Of course. And Mom," he added, his tone shifting to something that sounded almost nervous. "Margaret is going to be Emma's godmother. Sarah and I both wanted you to know that ahead of time, so it's not a surprise. Margaret, not me." Margaret, who'd known Emma for 2 months, would be given the spiritual responsibility for my granddaughter's faith and upbringing, while I, who'd single-handedly raised David, who'd sacrificed everything to give him a foundation of values and love, wasn't even considered. "That's wonderful," I heard myself say. "I'm sure Margaret will do a great job." After we hung up, I sat very still, feeling nothing. That was new. The complete absence of feeling. I'd moved beyond pain into a kind of emotional numbness that was almost peaceful in its emptiness. But that night, alone in my apartment, something stirred. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. Something that had been sleeping for months, crushed under layers of grief and self-blame. I thought about my mother, who'd died too young, but who'd lived fiercely. I thought about all the times she'd told me to stand up for myself, to never let anyone make me feel small. I thought about the young woman I'd been before David was born, strong, independent, full of dreams that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother. Where had she gone? When had I allowed myself to become so diminished that my own son could treat me like an inconvenience without consequence? I walked to my closet and pulled out a box I hadn't looked at in years. Inside were photos from my 20s. Me with friends, me at my high school graduation, me on a road trip with my college roommate. In every photo, I was smiling, confident, alive. When had I stopped being that person? The baptism was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to decide who I wanted to be when I walked into that church. 3 weeks to choose between continuing to accept my erasure or finally demanding something better. I spent those 3 weeks doing something I hadn't done in months, taking care of myself, not in big dramatic ways, but in small acts of self-preservation that felt almost rebellious after so much time spent making myself smaller, quieter, more invisible. I started eating again. Real meals, not just whatever was easiest to grab between shifts. I went to the library and checked out books I'd been meaning to read for years. I took walks in the park near my apartment, letting the March air clear my head and strengthen my legs that had grown weak from too much sitting, too much grief. Linda noticed the change immediately. "You look different," she said one afternoon. "Better. What happened?" "I'm tired," I told her. "Tired of disappearing." She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. I also did something I'd been avoiding for months. I wrote a letter to David, not to send, but to clarify my own thoughts, to put into words everything I'd been feeling but couldn't say. The letter grew to 7 pages, filled with hurt and confusion and questions that probably didn't have answers. Why wasn't I enough? What did I do wrong? When did you stop seeing me as your mother and start seeing me as an inconvenience? Do you remember the night you had pneumonia and I stayed awake for 36 hours straight, terrified I would lose you? Do you remember how I worked 3 jobs so you could go to college? Do you remember any of it? Or has Margaret's generosity erased all those years from your memory? I wrote it all out, let myself feel the anger and pain I'd been suppressing, and then I folded it up and put it in a drawer. Some truths were for me alone. The morning of the baptism, I dressed with care. I wore the same navy dress from David's wedding, but I'd had it altered to fit my thinner frame, and I'd added a white silk scarf that brightened the whole outfit. I did my makeup carefully, covering the dark circles that had become permanent fixtures under my eyes. I looked in the mirror and saw someone who was trying, not trying to compete with Margaret, but trying to show up for herself. The church was beautiful, old stone with stained glass windows that cast colored light across the wooden pews. I arrived early, wanting to choose my own seat rather than being directed to wherever was least convenient. I sat in the 4th row, close enough to see but not so close that I'd be in anyone's way. People began filing in. Margaret's family, Sarah's relatives, friends I didn't recognize. They filled the first 3 rows, a sea of well-dressed people who belonged to David's new world. Margaret arrived like royalty, wearing a pale pink suit that probably cost thousands of dollars. She was carrying Emma, who was dressed in an elaborate white christening gown with layers of lace and embroidery. People surrounded Margaret immediately, cooing over the baby, congratulating her. Sarah and David came in shortly after. Sarah looked recovered from childbirth, radiant in a cream-colored dress. David wore a dark suit and looked nervous in the way new fathers do at important events. He saw me and gave a small wave. Nothing more. The ceremony began, and I watched from my seat as the priest welcomed everyone, as he spoke about the sacred responsibility of raising a child in faith. I watched as Margaret stood beside the baptismal font, her hand on Emma's head, making vows to guide this child spiritually. The vows I should have been making, the role I should have been filling, but I stayed quiet, stayed still, just watched. And something strange happened during that watching. I started to see things I hadn't noticed before, details that my grief and self-pity had blinded me to. I saw how Margaret controlled every moment, the way she positioned people for photos, the way she corrected Sarah's hold on the baby, the way she interrupted the priest to suggest a different prayer. She wasn't just participating in Emma's baptism, she was directing it like a performance. I saw how David deferred to her constantly, looking to her for approval before making even small decisions. Should they use this blanket or that one? Ask Margaret. Should they take photos now or later? Margaret decides. And I saw something in Sarah's face, a tightness around her mouth, a forced quality to her smile when Margaret made another suggestion about how to hold her own baby. Sarah was Emma's mother, but Margaret was treating her like an assistant in the production of her grandmotherhood. After the ceremony, everyone moved to Margaret's house for the reception, the same house where I'd spent Thanksgiving feeling invisible. I almost didn't go, almost got in my car and drove home, but something made me stay. That same stirring I'd felt weeks ago, that quiet insistence that I stop running from my own life. The reception was predictably elegant. Catered food, professional decorations, a cake that looked like a work of art. Margaret held court in the living room, Emma in her arms, surrounded by admirers who praised her generosity, her taste, her obvious devotion to her new granddaughter. I stood near the refreshment table, eating small pastries and observing, just observing. And the more I watched, the more I saw. David was exhausted, not just tired from lack of sleep exhausted, but emotionally drained. He kept trying to take Emma from Margaret, and she kept finding reasons to hold on to her. Just one more photo, dear. Let me show her to the Hendersons first. You go eat something, I've got her. Sarah finally spoke up. Margaret, I'd like to feed her now. She's probably hungry. Oh, I can feed her, Margaret said immediately. You go enjoy the party. You've been so stressed. I'm her mother, Sarah said quietly, firmly. I'd like to feed my daughter. The room went quiet for a moment. Margaret's smile tightened, but she handed Emma over with exaggerated gentleness, making a show of how carefully she transferred the baby. Of course, darling. I just thought you might want a break. Sarah took Emma and walked quickly toward a back room, her jaw set. David followed her, looking uncomfortable. Margaret turned to her audience and laughed, a light, dismissive sound. New mothers are so sensitive. I keep telling her she needs to relax. That's when it clicked. Margaret wasn't helping David and Sarah. She was consuming them, taking over their lives under the guise of generosity, making them dependent on her in ways that looked like love but felt like control. And David couldn't see it. Or maybe he could. But the benefits of Margaret's wealth and attention were too valuable to risk losing by setting boundaries. I left the reception without saying goodbye to anyone. This time, my early departure wasn't about pain. It was about clarity. I'd been so focused on my own loss that I hadn't seen what David was actually gaining. A life of comfort, yes, but also a life where he would never quite be free, never quite be his own person. He'd traded one form of dependence for another, trading the mother who gave him everything she had for a mother figure who gave him everything he wanted, as long as he performed gratitude and devotion in return. The drive home felt different this time. I wasn't crying. I was thinking. Over the next few weeks, I made more changes. I finally got rid of David's bedroom furniture that I'd been storing in my apartment, the desk and bookshelf he'd left behind when he moved out. I donated them to a charity. The extra space made my apartment feel larger, less like a shrine to a relationship that no longer existed. I joined a book club at the library. The first meeting was awkward. I was the youngest person there by at least a decade, but the women were kind, and talking about literature felt like waking up a part of my brain that had been sleeping. I started saving money again, not for David, not for some future where he might need me, but for myself. Maybe a vacation someday. Maybe just the security of knowing I had something set aside. And I wrote more letters, not to David, but to myself, reminding myself of who I was, who I wanted to be, recording the small victories of each day, made it through a whole shift without crying, went for a walk even though it was cold, said no to an extra shift because I deserved a day off. It was during one of these quiet evenings at home, reading in my newly spacious living room, that my phone rang. David. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Mom, hey. He sounded stressed, his voice tight. Are you busy? Not particularly. What's going on? There was a long pause. I need to talk to someone. Can I come over? This was new. David hadn't been to my apartment in over a year, hadn't asked to see me in months. Of course, I said. When? Now? I'm actually nearby. 20 minutes later, he was sitting on my couch, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. His hair was messy, his expensive shirt wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed. What happened? I asked, sitting in the chair across from him, maintaining distance. I wasn't going to rush to comfort him the way I would have a year ago. He was an adult. He could use his words. I had a fight with Sarah, he said. A bad one. About Margaret. I waited. Let the silence do its work. Sarah wants to move, he continued. She found a job opportunity in another state. Good money, great position. But it would mean leaving here, leaving Margaret and her family. And you don't want to go. I don't know. He ran his hands through his hair, making it stand up at odd angles. Margaret has been so good to us. She helped with the down payment on our place. She's paying for Emma's daycare. She's done so much. How can we just leave? Those are gifts with strings, I said quietly. You know that, right? He looked up at me surprised. What do you mean? I mean Margaret has been very generous, but every gift comes with an expectation that you'll be available, that you'll include her in every decision, that you'll put her feelings first. She's just trying to help, David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Is she? Or is she trying to make herself indispensable so you can never leave? David stared at me for a long moment. When did you get so what? I don't know. Different. You seem different. I stopped waiting for you to need me, I said. Turns out that freed up a lot of energy for other things. He flinched. Good. Maybe he should feel uncomfortable. I never meant to, he started. To what? Replace me? Because that's what happened, David. You found someone who could give you more than I ever could, and you chose her. Mom, it's not like that. Isn't it? When was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you asked me for advice, or included me in something important, or acted like I was more than an obligation you had to fulfill? He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. I'm sorry, he finally whispered. I didn't realize. You didn't want to realize, I said, and my voice was steady, clear, because realizing would have meant acknowledging that you'd hurt me, that you'd taken everything I gave you and decided it wasn't valuable because it didn't come wrapped in expensive paper. David's eyes filled with tears. I was ashamed, he said quietly, of where we came from, of how we lived. When I met Sarah's family and saw how they lived, I just wanted that so badly. I wanted to be someone who belonged in that world, and I reminded you that you didn't. I finished for him. I was evidence of your past. The working-class mother who served people their breakfast while you were trying to impress people who'd never worked an honest day in their lives. That's not fair, he protested weakly. Isn't it? Be honest with yourself, David. When Margaret offered to be the grandmother Emma needed, weren't you relieved? Didn't it feel easier to let her take that role rather than have me around? Reminding everyone that your mother works at a diner? The truth of it hung between us like a living thing. He couldn't deny it. I could see it in his face, the shame and recognition warring with his need to defend himself. What did you say at your wedding? I asked, my voice softer now. When you were dancing with Margaret and everyone was watching? He looked confused. What do you mean? I saw you say something to her, something that made her smile. What was it? He paled slightly. Mom, I don't... Tell me. He took a shaky breath. I told her she was like a real mother to me. There it was. The confirmation of what I'd suspected, what I'd known in my heart but hadn't wanted to believe. He'd actually said those words, had actually spoken aloud what his actions had been screaming for months. I should have crumbled. A year ago, I would have. But now, I just nodded. Thank you for being honest, I said. That's more than you've given me in a long time. Mom, I didn't mean to hurt you. Margaret was so excited to be part of the wedding, and she'd done so much, and I wanted her to feel appreciated, at my expense. I didn't think about it like that. You didn't think about me at all, I said simply. And that's the problem, David. Not that Margaret is in your life, that's fine, good even, but you didn't make room for both of us. You replaced me. There's a difference. He was crying now, tears streaming down his face. What do I do? How do I fix this? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised who'd caused me more pain in the past year than I'd thought possible, and felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness, not yet, but not hatred either. Something more complicated, something that acknowledged both the love I still had for him and the boundaries I needed to maintain for my own survival. You can't fix it, I said. Not quickly, not with an apology or a grand gesture. You broke something that took 26 years to build. It's going to take time to repair if it can be repaired at all. But I want to try, he said desperately. Please, I want to make this right. Then start by being honest with yourself about Margaret. She's not helping you out of pure generosity. She's buying your loyalty, your time, your family. And Sarah sees it, even if you don't want to. Sarah says the same thing, he admitted. She's been saying it for months. I just thought she was being jealous or hormonal or… She's being smart, I interrupted. She's protecting her family. Your family. Margaret isn't going to stop until she controls every aspect of Emma's life, your marriage, everything. The question is whether you're going to let her. David sat with that for a moment, the weight of it settling visibly on his shoulders. I don't know how to tell her no, he said quietly. She's done so much for us. Every time I try to set a boundary, she gets hurt, or she reminds me of everything she's given us, and I feel guilty. That's called manipulation, I said gently. Real generosity doesn't come with conditions. Real love doesn't require you to sacrifice your autonomy in exchange for support. Is that what you did? He asked suddenly. Give without conditions? The question surprised me. Yes, I said. Everything I gave you was freely given. I never expected you to sacrifice your life or your choices because I worked 3 jobs to send you to college. I never expected you to stay small so I could feel important. I just wanted you to be happy. But you're not happy now. No, I admitted. I'm not. Because being forgotten isn't the same as being free to live your own life. I supported your independence. You just erased me. He absorbed this, wiping his face with his sleeve like he used to when he was a little boy. For a moment, I saw him, really saw him, not as the man who'd hurt me, but as the confused child I'd raised, trying to navigate a world that had given him more choices than he knew how to handle. Sarah wants me to tell Margaret that we're seriously considering the move, he said. She wants me to stop asking Margaret's permission for every decision we make as a family. That sounds reasonable. Margaret's going to be devastated. She's going to think we're ungrateful. She might even cut us off financially. Then you'll figure it out, I said. Like most people do. Like I did when your father left and I had a 2-year-old and no support system. You'll figure it out because you'll have to. Were you scared? He asked. When Dad left? Terrified, I said honestly. Every single day for years. But I did it anyway because that's what parents do. We figure it out. I'm scared now, he admitted. Scared of losing Margaret's support. Scared of disappointing her. Scared that Sarah's right and I've let Margaret take over our lives and I don't know how to get them back. Then be scared, I said. But do the right thing anyway. Choose your wife. Choose your daughter. Choose the life you actually want, not the life Margaret is building for you. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, I could hear the sounds of the neighborhood. Cars passing, children playing, the normal rhythms of life continuing regardless of personal drama. Can I ask you something? David said finally. Of course. At the wedding, why didn't you say anything? When I danced with Margaret instead of you, why didn't you speak up? I thought about that moment, about standing frozen between the tables while everyone watched my replacement take my place. Because I was still hoping you'd realize on your own, I said. I was still hoping that you'd see what was happening and choose differently. I didn't want to be the mother who made a scene, who embarrassed you, who proved that I didn't belong in your new world. You do belong, he said. Do I? Because your actions have said otherwise for a very long time. He didn't have an answer for that. The truth was complicated, messy, uncomfortable. I need to go, he said eventually. Sarah's waiting. We're supposed to talk tonight about the job offer. What are you going to tell her? I don't know yet, he said. But I know I need to start listening to her more than I listen to Margaret. That would be a good start. He stood, moved toward me like he wanted a hug. I stood too, but I didn't open my arms. Not yet. He noticed, and something in his expression crumbled a little more. I love you, Mom, he said. I know I haven't shown it, but I do. I love you too, I said. But love without respect, without consideration, without basic decency, that's not enough anymore. If you want a relationship with me, it needs to be real. I need to be more than an afterthought you remember when it's convenient. I understand, he said. Can I call you? To let you know what we decide? You can call me, I said. Whether I answer depends on whether you're calling because you want to talk to me or because you need something. He nodded, accepting this boundary. Then he left, and I was alone again in my apartment. But it felt different this time, not empty. just quiet. Peaceful almost. 3 days later, my phone rang. David. Mom? Do you have a minute? I do, I said, settling into my chair with my tea. Sarah and I talked. We talked for hours, actually. About everything. About Margaret. About our marriage. About what kind of life we want Emma to grow up seeing. And we're taking the job. Sarah's job. We're moving. I felt something loosen in my chest. Relief, maybe. Hope. Margaret doesn't know yet, he continued. I'm going to tell her this weekend. She's going to be upset. Probably angry. She'll definitely try to talk us out of it. She will, I agreed. Are you ready for that? No, he said honestly. But I'm going to do it anyway. Sarah deserves a husband who puts her first. Emma deserves to grow up in a home where her parents make the decisions, not her grandmother. And I deserve to figure out who I am without someone else defining it for me. I'm proud of you, I said. And I meant it. This wasn't the son I'd raised showing up. This was something harder. An adult making a difficult choice. There's something else, he said, his voice nervous. Before we move, Sarah and I want to have dinner with you. Just the three of us and Emma. At our place. A real dinner. Not some huge production. Would you come? I'd like that, I said simply. And Mom? I'm sorry. Really sorry. For all of it. I know saying it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I see what I did. I see how I hurt you. And I'm going to do better. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. After we hung up, I sat for a long time, watching the sunlight move across my living room floor. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. David and I had a long way to go before our relationship could be called healthy, before the hurt I'd accumulated could be processed and released. There would be more difficult conversations, more boundaries to set, more moments when I'd have to choose my own well-being over his comfort. But it was a beginning, and sometimes that's enough. The dinner happened 2 weeks later, on a quiet Thursday evening. I arrived at David and Sarah's apartment with a small bouquet of flowers. Nothing extravagant, just daisies from the grocery store, and a children's book I'd found at a used bookstore. One with beautiful illustrations that reminded me of the stories I used to read to David when he was small. Sarah answered the door, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely happy to see me. Not polite, not obligated, actually happy. Nora, come in, she said, taking the flowers with a real smile. These are lovely. You didn't have to bring anything. I wanted to, I said simply. The apartment was quiet, intimate. No catered food, no elegant decorations, just their home, with Emma sleeping in a bassinet near the couch and something simple cooking in the kitchen that smelled like garlic and tomatoes. David came out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He looked nervous, like a student about to take an exam he wasn't sure he'd studied enough for. Hey, Mom, he said. Thanks for coming. Thank you for inviting me, I replied. We sat down to dinner, pasta with homemade sauce, salad, bread that David admitted he'd burned slightly on the first attempt. It was imperfect and real, and I loved every minute of it. Sarah talked about her new job, her excitement mixed with nervousness about the move. David talked about how he'd told Margaret, about the tears and accusations and guilt trips that had followed. She said we were being ungrateful, David said, pushing pasta around his plate. That after everything she'd done for us, this was how we repaid her. How did you respond? I asked. I told her that gratitude doesn't mean giving up our autonomy, that we appreciate everything she's done, but we need to make decisions as our own family. He looked up at me. I used almost your exact words, actually. And? She hung up on me. Haven't heard from her since. That was 5 days ago. Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. It's been hard, but it's also been the first time in a year that I've felt like we're actually partners, making choices together instead of waiting for permission. After dinner, Sarah brought Emma to me. Would you like to hold her? She asked. I know we haven't given you much chance to be a grandmother. I took Emma carefully, this tiny person who carried my blood, my history. She looked up at me with dark eyes that reminded me of David as a baby, and something in my chest that had been locked tight for months finally opened. Hello, Emma, I whispered. I'm your grandmother, your actual grandmother. Sarah laughed softly. We want you to be part of her life, really part of it. not just token visits on holidays. David and I talked about it. When we move, we'd like you to come visit, as often as you want, and we'll come back here to see you too. We're going to do better, David added. I'm going to do better. I looked at my son, this man who'd hurt me so deeply, but who was finally trying to make amends. I believe you, I said, and I'm going to hold you to that. The evening ended with real hugs, the kind where you hold on for an extra moment and mean it. As I drove home, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope that had sustained me through the worst of it, but something quieter, steadier. The hope that comes from seeing someone actually change, actually try. The next morning, I woke up to a series of text messages. Not from David, from Margaret. The first one was long, explaining how hurt she was by David and Sarah's decision, how she'd only ever tried to help, how ungrateful they were being. Then came another, asking if I'd poisoned them against her during my dinner with them. I stared at those messages for a long time. A year ago, I would have been terrified, would have immediately called David to apologize for causing problems. But I wasn't that person anymore. I typed back a single message. Margaret, David, and Sarah are adults who made their own decision. I'm not interested in being pulled into drama. I wish you well. Then I blocked her number. Linda noticed the change in me during our next shift together. You're lighter, she said. Like someone cut strings you didn't know you were carrying. David and I are working on things, I told her. It's not perfect, but it's real. Good, she said firmly. You deserve real. 2 months later, David and Sarah moved. I helped them pack, spending a weekend wrapping dishes and filling boxes while Emma napped nearby. It felt good to be useful, to be included, to be treated like family instead of an obligation. Margaret didn't come to say goodbye. According to Sarah, she'd sent a final text saying she was done being taken advantage of, and that they'd regret their decision when they realized how much they'd given up. Do you regret it? I asked David as we loaded boxes into the moving truck. He looked at Sarah, who was strapping Emma into her car seat for the long drive. Not even a little bit, he said. Before they left, David pulled me aside. I found something when I was packing, he said. He handed me the photo album I'd made for his wedding, the one that had been left on a table and stained with wine. I never looked at it that night, he admitted. I was so caught up in everything else. But I looked at it yesterday. Really looked at it. The album was worn now, some pages bent, but someone had clearly spent time going through it recently. Every single one of these photos I remember, he continued, his voice thick. I remember you being there, working so hard to make things special even when we had nothing. And I just forgot, or didn't want to remember because remembering meant acknowledging what I was throwing away. You're remembering now, I said. That's what matters. There's a guest room in our new place, he said. It's yours. Whenever you want to visit, for as long as you want to stay. I hugged him then, this son I'd thought I'd lost. I'll come for Thanksgiving, I said, if the invitation still stands. It does, he said. It always will. 7 months later, I stood in that guest room, painted a soft yellow with a comfortable bed and a small desk by the window, unpacking my suitcase for a week-long visit. It was the week of Thanksgiving, and for the first time in 2 years, I was spending the holiday with my family, the real one. Not the borrowed, bought, conditional family that Margaret had tried to manufacture, but the messy, imperfect, honest family that Sarah, David, Emma, and I were slowly building together. Sarah was in the kitchen, teaching me her mother's recipe for stuffing. Emma was in her high chair, making a mess with sweet potatoes. David was attempting to wrestle a turkey into the oven while asking me every 5 minutes if he was doing it right. It was chaotic. It was imperfect. It was beautiful. Mom, David called from the kitchen. Can you come tell me if this looks right? I walked in, looked at his slightly lopsided turkey preparation, and smiled. It's perfect, I said, and I meant it. Not because the turkey was actually perfect. It wasn't. But because this moment was. My son was asking for my help. My daughter-in-law was including me in her traditions. My granddaughter was smiling at me like I was someone important, someone who belonged. That evening, after Emma was asleep and the turkey was finally in the oven, the 3 of us sat in the living room with tea. David pulled out his phone and showed me something, A message from Margaret. It was short. I hope you're happy with your choices. Are you? I asked him. He looked around the room, at the home he and Sarah had created, at the baby monitor showing Emma sleeping peacefully, at me sitting in the armchair that Sarah had picked out specifically so I'd have a comfortable place to sit during visits. Yeah, he said. I really am. Sarah leaned against him, and they looked like what they were, a young couple figuring things out, making mistakes and correcting them, building something real instead of something perfect. I learned something, David said, looking at me. Margaret could give me money, connections, status, all the things I thought I wanted, but she couldn't give me what you gave me. What's that? I asked. The freedom to fail, he said. To make mistakes and know I'd still be loved. To be imperfect and not have it held over my head. You let me be human. She wanted me to be grateful. I felt tears start to form, but these were different from the tears I'd cried over the past 2 years. These weren't tears of pain or loss. These were tears of recognition, of being seen, of mattering again. I was always going to love you, I said. Even when you hurt me, even when I thought I'd lost you. That's what real mothers do. We love you through the mistakes, through the bad choices, through the times when you forget we exist. We just love you. I know that now, he said. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember. Later that night, I stood at the window of my yellow guest room, looking out at the unfamiliar neighborhood in this unfamiliar city. Everything about this place was new. The streets, the sounds, the pace of life. But I wasn't scared of new anymore. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, standing in a wedding reception hall watching her son dance with someone else, feeling like her entire identity was crumbling. I thought about how much pain I'd endured, how close I'd come to losing myself completely in grief and self-blame. But I'd survived it. More than survived. I'd grown from it. I'd learned to love myself enough to demand better. I'd learned that real love doesn't require you to disappear, to minimize yourself, to accept crumbs when you deserve the whole meal. And I'd learned that sometimes the people we love most need to lose us before they can appreciate us. Need to choose wrong before they can choose right. Need to fall before they can learn to stand with integrity. My phone buzzed with a message from Linda. How's the visit? I typed back. It's good, really good. I'll tell you everything when I get back. She responded with a heart emoji and, proud of you. I was proud of me too. Proud of the woman who'd learned to set boundaries, who'd refused to accept less than she deserved, who'd walked through fire and come out stronger instead of broken. Thanksgiving Day was everything I'd dreamed about during those dark months of isolation. We ate too much, laughed at David's slightly dry turkey, took endless photos of Emma's first Thanksgiving. Sarah told stories about her childhood, and David shared memories of our modest holidays when he was growing up. Memories I'd thought he'd forgotten, but that he'd apparently been treasuring all along. As I helped Sarah clear the dishes that evening, she touched my arm gently. Thank you, she said. For what? For not giving up on him. On us. A lot of people would have walked away after how he treated you, but you stayed enough to be there when he was ready to see clearly again. He's my son, I said simply. That's what we do. No, she said firmly. That's what you do. Margaret would have cut him off the moment he didn't do what she wanted. You loved him enough to let him make mistakes and still leave the door open for him to come back. I thought about that later, lying in my comfortable bed in my yellow room. Sarah was right. Real love meant holding space for people to grow, even when that growth was painful to witness. It meant having boundaries without building walls. It meant being strong enough to walk away when necessary, but brave enough to try again when circumstances changed. The next morning, Emma toddled into my room. She was just learning to walk, and climbed onto my bed, patting my face with her small hands. Gamma, she said, her version of Grandma. And I realized something profound. This was what I'd been fighting for all along. Not just to be acknowledged or included, but to be genuinely, irreplaceably loved. To be someone's Gamma in a way that no amount of money or manipulation could replicate. David appeared in the doorway, smiling at the scene. She's been asking for you since she woke up, he said. I think you've got a fan. The feeling is mutual, I said, pulling Emma close and kissing the top of her head. Mom, David said, his voice serious now. I want you to know something. What happened at the wedding? What I said to Margaret? I think about it all the time. How I hurt you. How I was so desperate to belong that I betrayed the person who'd actually earned my loyalty. David, no. Let me finish. You're my real mother. Not because you gave birth to me, but because you showed up. Every single day. When it was hard. When you were tired. When you had nothing left to give. You showed up. And I took that for granted because I thought fancy dinners and expensive gifts were more valuable than the thousands of small sacrifices you made. I looked at my son, this man who'd finally grown into his own wisdom. We're here now, I said. That's what matters. Are we okay? He asked. Really okay? I thought about it honestly. Were we okay? Not yet. Not completely. Trust takes time to rebuild, and wounds this deep don't heal overnight. But we were on our way. We're getting there, I said. And that's enough. He smiled, relieved, and came to sit on the edge of the bed. Emma crawled between us, and for a moment, we were just 3 generations of people who loved each other, figuring out how to be a family. I stayed for the full week, and when it was time to leave, the goodbye was tearful, but not desperate. David and Sarah promised to visit in 2 months. Emma cried when I left, reaching for me from Sarah's arms. We'll see Gamma soon, Sarah told her. She's not going away. No, I thought as I drove home. I'm not going away. Not anymore. Because I finally understood my worth, and I wouldn't settle for being treated as less than essential ever again. The drive back to my city took 6 hours. 6 hours of thinking, processing, marveling at how much had changed in less than a year. I'd gone from broken to whole, from invisible to seen, from desperate to dignified. When I pulled into my apartment complex, Mrs. Chen was outside again, tending to her small garden. How was your trip? She called out. It was perfect, I said. And I meant it. My apartment felt welcoming when I walked in, not empty. My space, my life, my choices. I'd spent so long defining myself through David that I'd forgotten I was a complete person on my own. But I remembered now. I made tea, settled into my chair, and opened the book my reading group was discussing next week. Outside, the city continued its evening rhythms. Inside, I was at peace. My phone buzzed with a photo from Sarah, Emma holding a picture frame with my photo in it, the kind of frame you put in a child's room so they don't forget people between visits. The caption read, "She kisses your picture goodnight." I smiled, saved the photo, and sent back a heart. This was justice. Not the dramatic kind, with confrontations and revenge, but the quiet kind, where you reclaim your dignity, hold your ground, and let the people who hurt you realize what they almost lost. The kind where you don't have to diminish anyone else to stand tall. You just stand tall and let your worth speak for itself. David had called Margaret his real mother once, in a moment that nearly destroyed me. But Emma would grow up knowing exactly who her real grandmother was. Not the woman who could buy her expensive toys, but the woman who showed up, who loved without conditions, who stayed when it was hard. And maybe someday, David would tell Emma the truth, that he'd once been foolish enough to mistake wealth for love, generosity for authenticity, comfort for character, that he'd hurt the person who loved him most because he was too young and too dazzled to know better, but that his real mother, his actual, honest, imperfect, beautiful mother, had loved him enough to let him learn that lesson and had been strong enough to still be there when he finally understood. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, and that was more than enough. That was everything.